A widowed rancher took in 2 rejected Apache brides. What he built with them shocked the territory. The deed was already in the fire when I pulled it out. Not literally. It was sitting in the lockbox under the floorboard, same as always, but there's a kind of fire that doesn't need wood. My wife Elsa had been in the ground 11 days, and the deed felt like it belonged to someone else, some man who'd had a reason to hold land. I stood in the kitchen in the dark. It was maybe 3 in the morning, February, and the cold came through the south wall like it had a grudge. And I held that tin box against my chest and couldn't think of a single thing to do next. The ranch was called the Rafter Cross. 240 acres along the Cimarron, decent grass, a spring that didn't dry until August. We'd come out from Missouri in '71, Elsa and I, with a team, a wagon, and a crate of her mother's good china, which made it all the way to New Mexico territory without a chip. The china was still in the sideboard. I hadn't touched it since she died. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what to do with anything. My name is Walt Carver. I was 53 years old in the winter I'm talking about, and I'd put in 30-some years of work that most men half my age wouldn't have lasted through. Drought. A range war up near Cimarron that cost me 2 good horses and most of a summer. A grass fire in '78 that took the north pasture down to ash. And I'd come out of all of it standing, partly because I was stubborn and partly because Elsa wouldn't tolerate anything else. She used to say that the difference between a man who quits and a man who doesn't is about 12 hours sleep and something to eat. She was right about most things. But she was gone, fever. 17 days from the first sign to the last, and I never slept more than 2 hours running the whole time, and then it was over and the house was just walls and a roof, not a home anymore. The hands I had too, Darnell and a kid named Prout. They worked through and said little, which is what I needed. Darnell had been with me 8 years. He left a plate of beans on the table every evening without being asked, and I ate them standing at the counter because I couldn't sit in the chair I used to sit in when she was across from me. That was February. By April I had one hand, because Prout's family sent for him from Albuquerque, and I didn't blame him. By June I had none, because Darnell's back gave out. He came and told me straight, which was his way. Said he was sorry, Walt, and I believed him. I told him to take what he was owed from the lockbox, and he did, and he was gone by the next morning. I didn't say much because there wasn't much to say. So it was just me on a 240-acre place with 40-some head of cattle, and a spring that was already showing mud in the shallows, and I was doing the work of 3 men, and I was 53, and I was tired in a way that doesn't have a name. That's when they came. I heard the horses on the east road, which you can see from the porch if you know to look between the 2 junipers. It was late in the afternoon, the light cutting low and orange across the flats, and there were 2 of them, Apache women, riding together, leading one spare horse with a pack saddle. They stopped at the gate. They didn't come through. They sat there, and one of them looked at the house, and one of them looked at me. I walked out to the gate. Up close I could see they'd been riding hard. The horses needed water, and so did they, from the look of it, and one of them, the older one, maybe 35, 40, had a cut on her forearm that had been tied with a strip of cloth, and the cloth had dried dark. The younger one was maybe 20. She sat her horse like she'd grown up on it. Both of them looked at me the way people look when they're deciding something fast. The older one spoke first in English, not perfect but clear enough. She said they had been sent away from a man in Raton who had taken them as wives and decided after 3 months that he didn't want Apache women, that it was a mistake, and that he had sent them out with their horses and what they could carry, which wasn't much. She said their names. The older one was Saya, and the younger was Nita, which she told me was a shortened name, the full version being something I didn't have the mouth for. She said they had kin east of the mountains, but that it was 4 days' ride in country that wasn't friendly and they needed water, and if I could spare 1 night's shelter, they would be on their way. I looked at them for a moment. Then I opened the gate. I said the water was around back, at the trough, and that there was room in the barn for the horses. I didn't say anything else, and they didn't ask. I made coffee and there was half a pot of beans left from the morning, and I reheated them and cut bread and set it on the table and went out to the barn to check on the horses because I didn't want to stand over people while they ate. The horses were in better shape than I'd thought. Good animals, both of them. The spare was a gray mule, broad-chested, the kind you could pack hard and not lose. Somebody had taken care of them even when they weren't taking care of themselves. I came back in and sat down. Saya had eaten. Nita was still eating, steady, not rushing. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Saya asked about the cut on her arm, whether I had anything for it. I had a kit Elsa had put together and kept on the second shelf, and I got it down and set it on the table. Saya looked at it, and then she looked at me. She said, "You know what you're doing with this?" I said I'd stitched up a man's leg once and set 2 broken fingers and pulled 2 teeth, and she seemed to decide that was sufficient, because she held out her arm. I cleaned it. The cut was deeper than I'd thought, down to the muscle at the edge. I put 4 stitches in it, small ones, the way Elsa had shown me a long time ago. My hands were steadier than I expected. Saya didn't make a sound. Nita watched the whole time without moving. When it was done, Saya looked at the stitching for a long moment. Then she said, "Good." Just that good. I said they could stay the night in the barn, that there was a cot in the tack room and blankets, and that I'd have something hot in the morning before they rode on. Saya looked at the room, at the cold fireplace and the single lamp and the china and the sideboard, which you could see from where she sat. She looked at me for a moment, not saying anything I could read. Then she said, "You need help on this place." I said I managed. She said, "I can see that." She didn't say it sharp. She said it the way you say something true. I didn't answer. I went to bed. In the morning they were still there. Not in the barn. Saya was in the kitchen. She'd found the cornmeal and she had something going in the iron skillet, and the fire was lit and there was coffee already done. And she looked up when I came in and said nothing and went back to what she was doing. Nita was outside. I could hear the axe. She was splitting the wood I hadn't gotten to in 2 weeks. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen for a moment. Then I poured a cup of coffee and sat down. I don't know how to explain what happened next except to say it didn't happen all at once. There was no conversation that settled it, no arrangement made out loud. What happened was that I sat down to eat and the food was good and the coffee was hot and someone had split my wood. And when I went out to start the morning work, Nita had already checked the trough and noted the calf that was listing on its front left leg, and pointed at it without speaking, just pointed. And I went and looked at the calf and she was right. There was a stone wedged in the hoof, and I got it out and the calf was fine. And when I looked up, Nita was already doing something else. They stayed. Not because I invited them exactly, and not because they asked. What happened was that the work needed doing and there were hands to do it. And after 3 days, neither of us brought up the subject of their leaving. And after a week, it seemed like it would take more effort to address than to leave alone. And after 2 weeks, it was simply the way things were. I'm not a man who talks much about what he's feeling, partly by nature and partly because ranching doesn't leave you time for it, and the kind of men I'd come up around didn't make a practice of it either. But I'll say this. The house started feeling like a house again. Not the way it felt when Elsa was alive, I don't mean that. Different. But there was noise in it again. There was smoke from the chimney when I came in from the far pasture. There was someone to hand me a thing when my hands were full. Saya had a way of knowing what a place needed without being told. She walked the fence line the second week and came back with a list in her head, 3 broken posts on the north stretch, 2 more that were going, a section of wire that had rusted through, the gate hinge on the east road that I'd been meaning to fix since March and hadn't. She told me all of it standing in the yard, matter of fact, no judgment in it. I went and looked and she was right about everyone. Nita was something else. She was quieter than Saya, which is saying something, and she had a gift with the horses that I hadn't seen in a long time. Not tricks or show, just they settled when she was near. My roan that had been skittish since a lightning strike the previous summer would stand still for her when I couldn't get him to take a bridle without a fight. She figured things out by watching mostly. She watched me shoe a horse twice and then did it herself, clean and level. I didn't have to tell her anything. By July I had the south fence repaired and a new gate on the east road, and the cattle counted proper for the first time since Darnell left, and I'd put up more hay than I'd managed the year before with 2 hands helping. I was still tired. I was 53 and the work didn't get lighter. But it was a different kind of tired, the kind where you've done something, where there's a reason for it. The territory started to take notice, not all of it favorably. Rattan had talked, of course. The man there, I knew who he was by reputation, a cattleman named Fisk who had more money than judgment, had told his version of what happened, which was that his Apache wives had run off, not that he'd turned them out. There were men in Cimarron who believed him, either because they liked him or because it was easier to believe the white man in a dispute. There were men who came out to look at the rafter cross with a different kind of eye than before, not neighborly. One afternoon in late July, 3 men I didn't know rode up the east road and stopped at the gate. They didn't open it. They sat their horses and looked at the house and the yard, and one of them called out to me. I was at the woodpile, and said he'd heard I was running a Apache squaw camp and was that right. I set down the axe. I walked to the gate. I said, "You're on the wrong road." He said, "What road was that?" I said the road to somewhere I'd hear that word again and not do something about it. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the other 2. Then he turned his horse and they rode back the way they came, and I watched them until they were out of sight, and then I picked up the axe and went back to the wood. Saya was standing on the porch. She'd been there for some of it. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. I finished the wood. But word moves on the frontier. I knew that. And I knew the version moving wasn't the true one, and I couldn't control what men said on the other side of the mountains. What I could do was what I'd always done. Work the land, keep the place, be the same man Tuesday that I was Monday. The rafter cross would say what I was. The land keeps its own kind of record. In August, a man named Cordell, who ran cattle up the Riado, came by on a Sunday. He was a decent man, older than me by a few years, and he'd known Elsa. He sat on the porch and drank coffee and looked at the yard, at the order of it, at the hay in the stack and the fence lines and the horses in the corral. He didn't say much for a while. Then he asked me plain, "How are you managing, Walt?" I said I had good help. He looked at Saya, who was carrying water from the well and paying us no attention. Then he looked at me. He said, "I heard some things from Rattan." I said, "I expect you did." He said, "I don't hold with it." I didn't answer. He wasn't asking. He set his cup down and looked out at the flats and said, "My wife wants to know if they'd like to come to meeting on Sunday, if they're of a mind to. She said to say it was a general invitation. Nobody's business but the women's, is how she put it." I said I'd pass it on. He left an hour later, and I watched him ride north, and I thought about the fact that a man like Cordell, who'd been in this territory 20 years and knew everybody and had a long memory, had sat on my porch and drunk my coffee and said, "I don't hold with it." That was a thing worth having. The Sundays came and went. Saya went to meeting twice and then stopped. She told me, without apology, that she had her own way of praying and that it didn't require a building, and I said that seemed reasonable to me. Nita didn't go at all. Neither of them seemed damaged by the lack of it. I'd been writing letters. One to the land office in Santa Fe, because there was a question about the deed that Elsa and I had never fully resolved, a boundary line on the southeast corner that was ambiguous in the original survey. I'd been putting it off for 2 years. Saya found the papers in the lockbox one afternoon when I'd asked her to get something else, and she read them. She read better than most men I knew, it turned out, and I don't know exactly where that came from, and it wasn't my business to ask, and she said, "You need to get this fixed, Walt." I said I'd been meaning to. She said, "Before winter." So I rode into Cimarron in September and went to the land office and spent 4 hours with a surveyor going over the line, and I came out of it with the deed amended, and the southeast corner fixed, and 5 more acres than I'd thought I owned. I don't know if I'd have gotten around to it that year without being pushed. That's a small thing to say, but it wasn't small. The fall work is always the hardest, getting the herd sorted and the calves weaned and the hay stacked and the wood in and the outbuildings winterized, all of it in the time before the first hard freeze, which in the Cimarron country you never know exactly when it's coming. We did it, all 3 of us, working from first light to after dark on the long days, and on the short days past dark entirely, by lamplight in the barn when we had to. I learned things working next to those women. I'm not too old to say that. Saya had a way of reading weather that I've never fully understood. She'd look west in the morning and say 2 days, or say tonight, and she was almost never wrong. I started listening before I understood why. Nita found a shortcut in how we moved the cattle between pastures, a route along the dry wash that saved half a mile and kept them calmer, and I don't know how she figured it except that she had. We got the herd down to 41 good head by October, which was more than I'd expected, and the calves were solid, and the hay stack was the tallest I'd built on that place, and the fence lines were tight, and the woodpile, I won't say how tall it was because it sounds like bragging, but I'll say Darnell had never put up that much in a season, and he was a strong man. October was the night I'm thinking of. There was a storm coming in off the mountains, a real one, the kind that comes in October or November and gives you 2 feet if you're unlucky or 4 if you're not. The sky in the west had that yellow-gray color in the afternoon that means business, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees since noon. I got the horses in and checked the barn roof, which had 2 loose boards on the south end that I nailed down, and when I came in for supper the wind was already moving. We ate without talking much, the 3 of us at the table with the lamp turned up and the fire going. Saya had made a stew with the last of the dried venison and some root vegetables she'd been keeping in the cellar, and it was good, and we ate all of it. Nita fell asleep in the chair by the fire, which she sometimes did. She could sleep anywhere, that one, like a cat. Saya cleared the table and I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat back down. She sat across from me. Not in Elsa's chair, she'd never sat there. She'd chosen the chair beside the window. She sat there and held her coffee with both hands and looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "I want to say something." I said, "All right." She said, "My sister and I came here because we had nowhere else and you opened the gate." She paused and looked at the window where the wind was pressing. She said, "You did not have to do that." I said, "I did, though." She looked at me. I said, "A man doesn't leave 2 women at a gate." She said, "Some men do." I said, "I know." She was quiet for a while. The wind picked up outside and something loose on the porch rattled. I should have found that earlier and tied it down. I'd get it in the morning. She said, "I want you to know that we do not pity you. That is not why we stayed." I said I knew that. She said, "You are a hard man to know." She said it plain, not as a criticism. I said, "I've been told." She said, "But you are a man worth knowing." She looked at me steady. She said, "This place you have, it is a real place. You built it, and you will keep building it. My sister and I will help you do that as long as we are here and as long as you will have us." I looked at my coffee cup. She said, "What I want you to understand is that we do not stay out of debt. We stay because this is worth staying in." I didn't say anything for a while. There isn't always something to say. Some things land and you just have to let them land. Outside the storm hit in earnest, the first wave of it, coming down off the mountains, and the lamp flickered and steadied, and Nita stirred in the chair and pulled the blanket tighter and went back to sleep, And Saya and I sat there in the kitchen while the snow started, and I thought about what she'd said. Worth knowing, worth staying in. I'd built the rafter cross with Elsa and she was gone, and I'd almost let the grief take the whole thing down with her. And then this, two women who'd been thrown away by a man who didn't know what he had, who'd ridden to my gate with nowhere else to go and had found something here. Something solid, something that held. I thought about what Cordell had said on the porch. I don't hold with it. I thought about the men at the gate who turned their horses without pushing the matter, because something in my face or my hands or just the way I was standing had told them this was the wrong gate. I thought about the deed with the southeast corner fixed. I thought about the hay stack. I thought about 41 head of solid cattle and a fence that would hold through winter. I had built that, we had built that. Saya got up after a while and banked the fire for the night. I went out one more time to check the horses. The barn was warm, the animals settled, the roof holding, and came back in. The snow was coming sideways by then, thick and fast, the kind that fills the tracks behind you before you're 10 steps on. I stamped my boots on the step and went inside. The lamp was turned low, the fire was banked, Nita was still asleep. Saya was at the window, looking out at the white, and she turned when I came in. She looked at me the way you look at a thing you've decided on, clear and without question, and she said, "It will be a good winter." I said, "I think you're right." I took my boots off and hung my coat. I turned the lamp down to almost nothing. I sat in the chair that was mine and looked at the fire. A man gets measured different ways in this life. Some of it is his horses, or his cattle, or his fence lines, or what his hands look like. Some of it is who stands at his gate and who stays. I'd been measured in the hardest year of my life, without asking for it, and I'd come out the other side with a place that worked and two women who'd chosen it clear-eyed, not out of weakness or desperation, but because they'd looked at the rafter cross and at me and decided it was worth the choosing. You can't put a price on that. You can't manufacture it. Either you've earned it or you haven't, and the land knows, and the people who work it with you know. I sat by the fire while the storm pressed against the windows, and outside the snow was burying everything level. And in the morning there would be 2 feet of it, and we'd dig out and check the herd, and it would be a hard day's work, and the day after would be the same. I sat there and I thought, this is enough. This is more than enough. The fire burned low and the wind hammered the roof, and I closed my eyes. And for the first time since February, I fell asleep in my own chair, in my own house, without bracing myself against anything.